Welcome to this podcast in the series of The Heartbeat of Humanity. And I am Suzanne Akasha, Technical Advisor on MHPSS at the Reference Centre for Psychosocial Support for IFRC. And now you're listening to The Heartbeat of Humanity, podcast series for staff and volunteers in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, working with mental health and psychosocial support services. In this episode, we're going to talk about young people. Recently, there's been a lot of debate around the world on the sufferings and problems and challenges facing young people during the corona pandemic. Now we're 1 year into it, so we have asked Dr. Barbara Juen, who's a professor at the University of Innsbruck, and who is also part of the National Advisory Board on Crisis Interventions, and as Austrian Red Cross representative, and also very active in the Austrian Red Cross, scientific advisor to the European Network of Psychosocial Support, and a lot of other things, engaged in so much interesting research. And we have the wonderful chance of being with Vanessa Kulcar, who has a degree in psychology, and her master's thesis looked at young people, how they handle the threat of the climate change crisis. And currently, Vanessa is pursuing a PhD on students during the corona crisis. And this study will also compare reactions to corona to those of the climate crisis, if I understand correctly. We're going to talk about how handling global crisis, beginning with the corona pandemic, and that will be based on both of your areas of research. So, Barbara, would you start the presentation, please?
Good. Let's start. When the pandemic began 1 year ago, we didn't really expect young people to be such a vulnerable group. So in the beginning, we just, if I just start with what we experienced, we started our long-term studies. Everybody started studies on the long-term effects, like studies that went not only on one point in time, but several points. And we checked different groups in the population. We were aware of older people. We were aware of people with psychological problems. We were aware of migrants. We were aware of women, etc. But we were not aware about the younger people. But what we saw very early on, and also the international studies saw it, everybody saw it, young people between 16 and 30, this was normally the group, are especially vulnerable and have much more stress than other age groups. What we also did in the beginning, before we start this presentation, is we looked at the question, perhaps they have had more stress even before the pandemic. So we checked. And Vanessa, you want to say something very shortly about that at this moment, because you did a study before the pandemic.
Yeah, in the study before the pandemic, I was looking at climate change and like depressive and anxiety symptoms associated with that. And so it actually was like people worrying a lot about climate change, and especially being hopeless about climate change, had higher rates of depressive and anxiety symptoms. So we already had that crisis affecting young people. And there are a lot of other studies looking at young people without any crisis to specify it. And they are also finding quite high rates of mental health issues in young people.
That's very worrying, yes.
Yeah, and
so already before.
Yes, and what we really see is that especially this age group between 16 and 30 is affected by a lot of stress, and this was even before the pandemic. This is important to say it before we start this presentation, because that's a background.
Absolutely.
Okay, you can give us.
Yeah, here we go.
So here you see it. If we look at the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on mental health, we see several risk factors. Female gender. Women are more affected because they are working more in the frontline area. They are more affected because violence is rising, and because of some other reasons. But the younger age group is also a vulnerable group here. You see the chronic or psychiatric disorders, the unemployment, and combined with the younger age is the student status. And what you see on the left side, here you see the rates. So anxiety rates in the different studies are between 6 and 15%, depression rates between 15 and 48%, which is really high. PTSD between 7 and 45%, which is also rather high. And stress in general, depends on what you measure, is between 8 and 82%. Sounds high, but here you have to be a little bit careful, because this means also the everyday stress in a way. So
yeah, sure.
Stress, yes. Mm-hmm.
And I already have a question, because when looking at it, I'm wondering, why do people have PTSD? The corona pandemic came. It's a virus disease. We've had plenty of those before. We have the flu. We have everything else. We have swine flu. We have bird influenza. We've known other epidemics. So why does that result in PTSD?
If you look at PTSD, you have to look at both sides. One side is the symptom side. So in PTSD, you have these intrusions, these memories that you cannot control. You have the hyperarousal. You cannot sleep anymore. You are really aroused. You cannot concentrate. And then you have the third one. You have avoidance. And if you look at only these symptoms, and what happened in the COVID pandemic was that in the beginning in Europe, if I only stay in Europe for a moment, in the beginning we had this situation in Italy, and we had these pictures from Bergamo where you saw many dead bodies being taken away by the military. Many people. We did not only questionnaires but also interviews, and many people that we interviewed said it's like a war. And you always heard this war metaphor from people. They said it's like a war, but without the destruction. It's like a war, but with open shops. It's like a war, but. So everybody compared it to a war situation. And it was also a situation where, and this is also important for trauma, it was a situation where your illusions of safety were really endangered. So the general feeling of safety was endangered much more than with the swine flu or with other pandemics or epidemics like Ebola, where we always in Europe think it's far away, we are not affected, or such things. And this you could not do with this COVID-19. And regarding the symptoms, there is a high correlation between the social media use and the symptoms. So the more you use the social medias and get all those pictures, the more you react with intrusions, but also with hyperarousal and with a certain form of avoidance. That may also in the situation now may also go as far as avoiding the topic at all, and saying there is no virus, or the virus is not dangerous at all.
Thank you. That clarified the question completely. Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
So you can give us the next slide. Let's see what we have. So if we have the younger people, and we have it in all different groups, we do, for example, in our studies, we do a lot on healthcare personnel. And if we take the Red Cross, for example, in the Red Cross, it's the same pattern everywhere. So also in the Red Cross, our youngest volunteers, our youngest staff are those who show the most stress symptoms. In the hospitals, it's everywhere. Everywhere, the youngest age groups show the highest stress levels of all groups. And the largest drop in mental health and the largest drop in well-being also. So this is really a group that has difficult values. You see 71, this is again the international studies, 71% elevated stress level, 91% health-related worries, 86% sleep disturbances, 86% social isolation. This is also something that's interesting because in Austria we did a study on social isolation and loneliness, yes? And the feeling of loneliness is when you are isolated in a way, but you want to have more contact. So you crave for contact. That's loneliness. And in Austria, they did a big study on the whole population and about loneliness, and they found only the young people feel lonely. The older people who are more socially isolated, they don't feel lonely, or not so many of them. So also loneliness was a phenomenon that was more prominent in this age group, and disturbed eating behaviors and depressive thoughts. That's the things that have been found. Vanessa, you want to say something about this slide? You want to add something?
Well, I could add, according to the depressive thoughts, in our study we did use a scale to measure depression, like an actual pathological scale, and I myself was really shocked at the high rates of depression we got there, because nearly half of the students we asked qualified for a depressive disorder according to the scale. Of course, you can't diagnose a depressive disorder just by using one scale, but the results still were really worrying.
And I think this is what has been reported from many other countries and studies as well, also from children out of school. Now we're looking at young people, but it seems to be the same. I understand that, shows how important social engagement is for us. And I've even heard somebody say that, well, I'm introvert and I like to stay alone, but now I realize how dependent I am upon being social with others. Yeah. Should I go on?
Actually, because you said children at school, actually some colleagues of us, they do a big study on children, and they had an interesting finding regarding the children. What they saw was that they asked the children and their parents about their well-being, yes? And the interesting finding was that the mothers, they estimated the stress of their boys rather correctly. But with the girls, they underestimated the stress of the girls extremely. So with the girls, they didn't see the stress.
That's a very good point before.
Saw nothing, but with the boys, they saw the stress.
Yeah. 8th of March is coming up, International Women's Day, so we should be aware of this.
Very important to see always the intersectional things, yes, like age and gender.
And gender, absolutely. Right, I'll go on to the next slide. Thank you.
So, you want to say something to this slide, Vanessa? I give the floor to you.
Yes. I think if you just look at young people and don't really think a lot about it, you could get the impression that they don't really have a lot of problems during the pandemic, because they can stay at home, they can do distance learning and things like that. They are not exposed in any way, and they are not a high risk group. But if you look more closely at what stressors they actually have, they are a lot of things. It's like, for example, the social contacts. They have less stable social networks than older people, partly because some of them moved away from home to go to university. They are far away from their families. They didn't really have time to make new friends, and that can cause a lot of loneliness and isolation. And in the education, it's not that easy to adapt to distance learning, at least not for everybody. Some people can adapt really well, but some really have problems just being at home and studying. It's really difficult for them, and then they worry about their performance at university. Some report an elevated workload, and then again there's this missing social support because they don't have contacts to their peers at university. Then there's this economic part. Young people just started employment, or for example, students often have part-time jobs, and they are not as secure, and so they are very much affected by unemployment and financial problems, and have less securities than older people. And what they're worrying about as well is future job opportunities, because the economy is not in a really good situation right now, and on top of that, they are worrying if their degrees are accepted as much as they were before, because some of them will only have distance learning during the whole time of studies, and they are worrying that future employers don't really like students who just had distance learning. And they're also worrying about health, not necessarily that much about themselves, but about vulnerable groups or family members, and they are also worried about infecting others. And what's true for basically all of the population is that they're missing leisure activities. They don't really have a work-life balance anymore, because they can't go out and they can't have this balance of doing something else than just studying. And for some of them, it's also difficult that they are having to move back to their parents, because they moved out to go to university or for whatever reasons. Then they are losing their jobs, and they're having distance learning, so they are having to move back. And that's not that easy to kind of accept that you are kind of stepping back from your developmental path and moving back into your parents. So there are actually a lot of different stressors for young people.
Yeah, and I think that the one that you're mentioning about the future job opportunities also links to the one to before, when you talked about the hope that are crushed because of the climate crisis. So there will be even more worries about the future.
Yeah, and if you look at the situation that we have at the moment in Spain, you see a whole generation of young people who have no chance at all, and who say our only chance is to go to the street and be violent. Because nobody is listening to us. And we also have this phenomenon here in Austria that young people, if you talk to them, they say nobody is listening to us. Right. Nobody wants to hear us. Yeah. And they don't have a voice. Nobody listens to them. I read a letter from a 14-year-old who wrote a letter to the newspaper, where she said, you don't listen to us, and you say we are a lost generation, and we didn't learn anything in the last year, but we learned a lot, and we really did a lot, and we sacrificed a lot for the older generation.
Yeah, that needs to be
see it, and nobody talks about that.
Yeah, that needs to be acknowledged, definitely.
Yes. Yes, and we have to get a voice. And another thing that I want to add is we have another big population study in Austria, and I think this is not an Austrian phenomenon, that shows that young people in families are more exposed to violence at the moment, and to conflicts.
Yes.
This is also a very important aspect that
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me move on.
In general, young people are in this developmental phase that's called emerging adulthood, and it's just between adolescence and adulthood, and it's characterized by this profound changes and trying out different things, trying out different roles, thinking about where you want to go with your life, and there are different steps like sexual maturation, completion of education, early employment, establishing important relationships. So if you think about it, there's a lot of interaction with your environment as well, and that's kind of difficult even without a pandemic, but with the pandemic, when everything else is on hold, it's even more difficult. And even before the pandemic, there were 1 in 4 to 5 young people with a mental illness. And when they questioned Austrian students about their stress level, about half of them reported elevated stress levels. We know that there are rising health problems across the populations, but especially in young people. And on top of that, there's this factor that they have little experience with crisis and how to cope with them. So they can't go back and say, okay, I managed this, I survived this, I was okay after this, so I will be okay now as well. They don't really, they can't fall back on that experience.
So am I correct in assuming that a lot of young people today, at least in our part of the world, they have been really like pushed, and their parents, caregivers have held them and carried them, so they haven't experienced much adversity? That's also part of what you're saying, that they don't have this experience with crises.
Yes, on the one hand, what we see is they don't have a framework for this. I would say. Because if we talk to the older people, they say this situation is like the war, but the shops are open. This situation is like Chernobyl, where you also didn't see the enemy, but with more restrictions. This situation is like the flooding, but yes. But the young people, they don't have this framework. So for the young people, it's a situation where they have to orient themselves new. This is one thing that we see. So I don't think they have little experience with crisis in total, because many of the young people, they are born into a crisis. They are born into the financial crisis.
Yeah, that's correct.
Like if you see the young people now in Spain, they are born into a crisis. They are living in a crisis. But what I find very, very difficult is that they are, on the one hand, you are right, Ea, they are their parents in many parts of Europe, where you have the resourceful countries, especially their parents pamper them a little bit and put away all the adversities from them. But at the same time, and mostly the same parents, put a lot of pressure on these young people in the area of academic achievement. So on the one hand, you are very, very much protected, but on the other hand, you are pushed forward in the achievement sector, but you cannot achieve what your parents expect from you anymore. So, and you even cannot achieve what your parents have achieved with much less effort. And that's what leads to something that in developmental psychology, we speak of the quarter life crisis, of many, many young people having a big crisis because they are reaching 30 and having not reached what their parents have reached with 30. And because the situation is completely different now, and they really cannot reach that.
Yeah. And as you mentioned in an earlier slide, there's this, or you're going to talk about it later, I think, there's this powerlessness about doing anything. As an individual, you can maybe sort your waste, you can sort plastic and stuff, but I mean, from looking at the climate crisis or a pandemic, there's not so much you can do.
Yes.
Right, that leads to, okay, so thank you very much. Very, very clear. I'm going to move on.
Vanessa.
So these are actually our own results. We did 3 surveys in April, so in the beginning of the crisis, and then in July, August, like when it was relatively calm and low infection rates and little measures. And then during the second lockdown in Austria in November and December. And what we see is that there's a deterioration of mental health between the first and the second lockdown in Austria. So stress level was elevated and well-being was reduced already during the first lockdown, and it didn't get better during the little pause during summer, and it got even worse during the second lockdown. So that's kind of worrisome that they didn't recover at all during this pause of crisis and are feeling worse now.
And can I ask you the age group that you studied in this particular study?
They were on average 23 years old.
All right. So it's
So it's all university students.
Right. Okay. Should I go on?
Yes, please.
And we ask them what they are feeling when they're thinking about the COVID crisis. And what we see is that there are a lot of feelings of powerlessness. They are concerned, they are worried, they are stressed. Like all these negative emotions are really, really high. And I also did the same survey on climate change before, and what we did see there was you could really discriminate between feelings of powerlessness, helplessness, and hopelessness, and other feelings. And you can't really do that now in the COVID crisis. There's a whole mixture of different feelings towards the COVID crisis that wasn't there for the longer term crisis of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Right, and some people are also getting angry and enraged, I see. So it's not only these feelings. So what do they do? Are they the one banging pots in the streets in fury or demonstrating?
No, everybody. No. At the moment, we can compare this also to our other studies, because we have big groups that we studied. We studied the population, we studied healthcare workers and the young people, and we see it in all groups. Everybody now in the second wave in Austria, or in the situation where we could have an end in sight with the vaccine. In this situation, people now feel powerless, and everybody is angry and frustrated. So this is a general thing. But with young people, it's even more than with the others. And this anger doesn't directly translate to aggression in everybody. But everybody feels angry. But what we have to see here is we also have these disaster phases. In disasters, we normally see the first phase, which was the first lockdown, where people are very anxious. It was more about fear, not about anger, and they feel very much solidarity with everybody, and everybody feels like this is the honeymoon phase. Everybody sticks together, and together we will face this crisis. But now we are in the disillusion phase, which is often a phase in disasters, where people get frustrated and angry and have no hope anymore. And we are in this phase now. Yes. So on the one hand, it's a normal phase in disasters, but I think it has a specific smell, or a specific it's specific here in the COVID crisis. And the difficult thing is, if people really stay powerless for a long time, they either get depressed or aggressive. Yeah. So that's the powerlessness is what makes us a little bit, it's not worried. A good diagnosis.
Yeah.
Worried, yes.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
We also asked them about their economic situation. And we see that most students don't have financial issues, but about a quarter of them, which is enough to worry, they report that they experience a deterioration of their financial situation. and this can mostly be associated with changes in employment. So the students who are not working, or because they get their money from their parents, for example, they don't really experience this situation of financial situation, and the people who are not experiencing changes in their employment or are just in home office, they don't really report it as well. But it's the ones with shortened or paused employment, or who are unemployed due to the crisis, they experience this economic hardship.
Yeah.
What we have to say here is what we see worldwide is we see a polarization between those who are privileged and those who are not. We see it also in this slide. Yeah. So also in the students, we have this polarization between people who are affected much more by the crisis than those who have more resources.
So this slide, or this study, part of the study actually only goes to supporting what we assume and know from some studies, that there's a polarization going on in those who have and those who have not.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, I can't. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Change to the next slide.
Yeah, this shows mainly that students worry a lot about others and not so much about themselves. Most economic worries about the economic consequences are not that high compared to other worries. It's altruistic worries that's really high. Like most students say they are worrying about vulnerable people, or they are worrying about populations who are disadvantaged even before the corona crisis, and they are worrying a lot about them. And they are worrying about the psychological consequences, like mental health during the lockdown. And they are also having health concerns, and those health concerns are not really that much about themselves. As you can see, they are not really worrying that much about catching COVID themselves, but they are worried about passing on COVID to someone else.
Yeah, so as we already said, COVID-specific stressors are adding to the pre-existing stressors and mental health problems. Long-term problems are to be expected if these mental health issues are ignored. And students and young people are society's future working force, but nobody sees it at the moment, I would say. So now there is a beginning to realize that. I heard the WHO is starting working groups where young people also get a voice, and we also start a program in the health ministry in Austria that focuses also on young people and how to make them more visible and how to give them more.
But it's been a long time in the making. It's been a long time coming.
Absolutely, we say since last March we are.
Yeah, it's a year into the crisis and only now.
Yes.
Right. So you have a slide on the interventions to support young people. So what can we do?
Vanessa, do you want to say something?
Yes, the main part is, of course, promoting and expanding the existing psychosocial support systems, because we don't have to invent everything new, which is there already, but we have to support what is there. And then some small changes can help, like talking about physical distancing instead of social distancing, because we don't want to social distance, and so we don't want to cause loneliness. We just want to want physical distancing. And for the people who are financially who have financial problems, there's financial support really important. This doesn't only affect the mental health, but it's also important for compliance and adherence, because people worrying about their economic situation, they are not as willing to adhere to the measures as others. And clear communication and reliable information, of course. We have to look more into digital therapy and psychoeducation. because face-to-face therapy is not a really good idea right now, of course. And especially for younger students, we should look into establishing opportunities for maintaining and establishing contacts, because, for example, like first semester students, they are coming to the university and they don't know anybody. They have no chance of getting to know their peers, because they're just not the proper opportunities to how should they get to know someone if they have no contact information or anything. And what we already talked about is acknowledging that they are having difficulties and acknowledging that they are making sacrifices, and not only talking about young people partying and things like that, but they are doing their part, and we should really acknowledge that.
Thank you. There's one interesting thing, a question comes up, because digital therapy, I've seen some studies saying that, proving that can be as efficient, sometimes even better, working better than face-to-face therapy. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, a colleague of ours is doing a study at the moment with digital therapy with students. What they did is they do cognitive behavioral therapy sessions that are on an app. This is an app that can be done by the students every evening. And what they saw is that if you only give them the app, it doesn't work. There's no compliance. So what you have to do is combine the digital therapy with a face-to-face and online interaction with a coach. So they have a coach, and this coach is collecting all the students in the groups and is coaching them during this process of this digital therapy, and then it works. And a similar experience we also have in just in teaching, for example. In the beginning, what we did was just giving them the information via the online, and this is not good, because what they need is interaction. You have to do something that they get to know each other in the group, and you have to make a lot of interactive processes. I think, you developed such a lot of tools for doing that.
Exactly. And it's also based on some studies about exactly what you're saying, that children in school, what they miss is actually, their friends, 90% miss their friends. But then next comes the individual attention from the teacher during the digital sessions.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're social beings. We need social contact and attention.
Yes, and we see it even in our studies, because another colleague is doing a study in the schools, and what she says is that there's extreme difference between schools. In some schools, the pupils even got better than before. Because the teachers were really interactive. They were really proactive, going to the students and talking to them. And then it worked. But in those schools where you only do this, you give them homework and you put things in the net and expect them to read it or look at it or do something with it, this doesn't work.
Yeah, and this issue here is that for some societies where you don't have so much internet opportunity, where it's not free for everybody, that can be a challenge. Yes. So that there will be many children lost in their basic education because they didn't get the support and interaction they needed. That's also established.
Also in the resourceful countries, you lose around 10 to 20% of the students, or the pupils in the schools, and many pupils they quit school. And I think in less resourceful countries, this is much more.
Yes. Of course. I'm going to show the next slide and the next one. And this is just so that the viewers can see the literature that goes behind the presentation that we've had today. And there's one slide, and you can pause and you can find the literature. And there's another here where you can find and have access to the literature that today's session has been based on. Also, it's been based on the studies that is ongoing at the university under Dr. Barbara Juen with Vanessa. Now I forget again, Kulcar, the last name, and I will stop sharing and get back to you. So Any last comments from you? It's been really exciting to hear from you.
Not really. I think everything has been said more or less, but I enjoy very much discussing with you about these problems.
You have been listening to or seen to The Heartbeat of Humanity, a podcast series for Red Cross, Red Crescent staff and volunteers about mental health and psychosocial support. And you can find more resources on our website, pscentre.org, and also on Facebook and whatever we do. And I'm here, Suzanne Akasha. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast with Vanessa Kulcar and Barbara Juen from Austrian Red Cross and the University of Innsbruck. Thank you very much.